He put his hand over my mouth and whispered, "Let me finish." Those 4 words changed everything in my life, and they might change yours too when you find out why they were so powerful in that moment. My name is Marcus Thompson, I'm 19, and I just finished my basic training in the U.S. Army at Fort Carson, Colorado. I grew up in a small town where everyone knows everyone and being different isn't exactly accepted. That's why I enlisted as soon as I turned 18, not out of patriotism or a thirst for adventure, but because I was running from something inside me that I couldn't understand or accept. At the military base, I thought I'd finally fit in. The tough workouts, strict discipline, and military routine all seemed like the perfect solution to get my head on straight. I was good at what I did, especially equipment maintenance. I had a natural knack for engines and machines that even the toughest instructors recognized. But even so, that feeling of not belonging followed me like a shadow. If you've ever had those moments where everything changes with a simple look, hit like so I know I'm not alone on this journey. Fort Carson stretches for miles across the Colorado Plains, with its gray concrete buildings clashing brutally with the Rocky Mountains rising in the background. The air here is dry, constantly filled with the sharp smell of diesel, metal heated by the relentless sun, and that distinctive red dust that sticks to your boots and won't come off. The sounds are a constant soundtrack to my life. Morning sirens cutting through the silence at 5 a.m. Hundreds of boots marching in perfect sync across the concrete courtyards. The deafening roar of engines in the hangars, and the harsh voices of sergeants echoing through the halls with an authority that doesn't accept questions. What you hear here is just the beginning. The full, unfiltered stories with all the details you can imagine are now available. Check the link in the description right now. My routine was mathematically precise. I'd wake up with the first siren, jump out of bed before I was even fully awake, and head for the physical exercises that left my body aching and my mind momentarily free from the thoughts I preferred to avoid. The mornings were filled with training under the scorching Colorado sun, where I learned that sweat can be both punishment and purification. But it was the afternoons in the maintenance hangars that I truly looked forward to. There, surrounded by the comforting noise of tools and the familiar smell of oil and fuel, I found a peace that didn't exist anywhere else on base. My hands seemed to have a life of their own when working on the components of military vehicles. Every part had its place. Every problem had a logical solution. Every repair followed clear rules that made sense. The nights were the worst. After dinner in the noisy mess hall, I'd go back to the shared dorm with 8 other soldiers and try to focus on military manuals. I'd write letters home that I never sent, always starting the same way. "Dear Mom, I'm doing well here at the base." But the words never flowed beyond the first line. Because how could I explain to her that I was running from something I couldn't even name? It was during a routine inspection in the main hangar that my life took a completely unexpected turn. I was working on a crucial part of a Black Hawk helicopter's hydraulic system when my wrench slipped. The sound of the metal hitting the concrete echoed through the entire hangar, followed by a deadly silence when I realized I had broken a valve that cost more than my 6-month salary. The other recruits around me started whispering nervously. Everyone knew that breaking military equipment resulted in severe punishments, from extra duty to a possible court-martial, depending on the value of the damage. I stood there, holding the pieces of the broken valve, feeling my military future crumble along with that metal. Just then, I heard firm footsteps approaching from behind. I didn't need to turn around to know it was a superior. The sound of their boots was different, more confident, heavier. I swallowed hard, bracing myself for the lecture that was coming, when a deep voice cut through the tension in the hangar. "Everyone makes mistakes, soldier. The difference is how you handle them." I turned slowly and met the most intense green eyes I had ever seen. The man in front of me wore a sergeant's uniform, with insignia indicating he was a specialist in aircraft maintenance. He must have been about 24, with regulation military-cut brown hair, but there was something about him that set him apart from the other officers. A calmness that contrasted with the generally tense atmosphere on base. "Sergeant Hayes," he introduced himself, extending his hand. "Dylan Hayes. And you must be the Thompson everyone's talking about. They say you have a golden touch for mechanics." I shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that indicated years of manual labor. His eyes held mine for a few seconds longer than military protocol would normally allow, and I felt something strange in my stomach, a mix of nervousness and a feeling I chose not to analyze at that moment. "Sergeant," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm so sorry about the equipment. I can pay for the repairs, or accept any punishment that—" He raised his hand, cutting off my apology. "Relax, soldier. These valves break all the time. They're just poorly designed. I've got some spares in my workshop. How about you help me install the replacement? That way you learn the correct technique and I get an assistant. The offer caught me completely off guard. Other officers would have given me a monumental chewing out, put me on latrine duty for a week, or worse. But Dylan, Sergeant Hayes, I mentally corrected myself, was offering help instead of punishment. There was something in his expression that conveyed confidence, as if he saw potential in me that I didn't even know I had. Yes, sir. It would be an honor to learn from you, I replied, trying to sound professional despite the gratitude in my voice. Over the next 2 hours, Dylan taught me maintenance techniques that weren't in any manual. He had a way of explaining things that made everything seem simple. His hands moved with surgical precision over the components, and he spoke with a genuine passion about every part of the military equipment. What struck me most was how different he was from the other officers. While most sergeants yelled orders and expected blind obedience, Dylan explained the why behind each procedure. He treated me like a potential equal, not some ignorant recruit who needed to be forcibly molded. "You have a natural talent for this," he commented when we finished installing the new valve. "Ever thought about specializing in aircraft maintenance? You could have a solid career in the Army, or even in the civilian sector afterward." The suggestion surprised me. Until then, I was just trying to survive basic training without thinking much about the future. But the way Dylan talked about careers and possibilities made me realize that there might be more options in military life than I had imagined. "I never thought about it, Sergeant. I've always liked fixing things, but I never imagined it could be a real profession." He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from a superior since I arrived on base. "Look, Thompson, I'm going to make you an offer. I have a few extra projects here in the hangar during the night shifts. If you want to learn more advanced techniques, you can stop by after dinner. Of course, only if you're interested in expanding your knowledge." I accepted without hesitation. Not just for the opportunity to learn, but because there was something about Dylan that made me want to spend more time in his company. He was different, more deliberate, more observant, with a presence I couldn't define, but that inexplicably drew me in. On that first night, as we worked side by side in the empty hangar, I began to understand why Dylan had such a respected reputation on base. He was meticulous without being obsessive, demanding of himself without being cruel, and had an impressive technical knowledge. More importantly, he treated me like a work partner, not a subordinate. Over the next week, our nightly meetings became routine. Dylan always showed up with a thermos of strong coffee and some sandwiches he made himself, turning our work sessions into something that felt more like informal dinners. He started telling stories about his 2 missions in Afghanistan, and I was fascinated listening about places and experiences that seemed to belong to another world. "The first time you see a downed helicopter in the middle of the desert," he said one night while we were adjusting an aircraft's navigation system, "you realize how every part, every screw, can mean the difference between life and death. That's why I take this job so seriously. It's not just maintenance. It's a responsibility for the lives that depend on this equipment." His words touched me deeply. Until then, I saw maintenance as just a technical job, but Dylan made me understand that there was a human dimension to everything we did. Every perfect repair could save lives. Every bit of negligence could cause tragedies. As the days passed, I started to open up about my own story. I told him about the small town where I grew up, about the reasons that led me to the Army, about my doubts regarding the future. Dylan listened with an attention I had never received before, without judging, without giving unsolicited advice, just absorbing my words as if they truly mattered. "You know," he said one night, "running from something isn't always cowardice. Sometimes it's the only way to survive until you find enough strength to face the truth." His words echoed in my mind for days. There was something in the way he spoke that made me suspect he was also running from something, that our connection went beyond professional interest or simple camaraderie between soldiers. It was during our 3rd week of nightly meetings that I realized something was changing between us. The moments of comfortable silence were filled with a different kind of tension, an energy I didn't know how to interpret. When we passed tools to each other, our fingers would touch for fractions of a second longer than necessary. When he positioned himself behind me to show me a technique, I felt the warmth of his body in a way that made me nervous and confused. But it wasn't just physical attraction, although I fought not to acknowledge that was exactly what I was feeling. It was a deeper connection, as if Dylan saw parts of me that I didn't even know existed. He challenged me intellectually, supported me emotionally, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I could be my authentic self with someone. The problem was that this authenticity included feelings I knew were forbidden in the military environment. The U.S. Army had clear policies about same-sex relationships, and the consequences of being discovered could destroy not only my career but my entire life. I had enlisted to run from who I was, not to confront these issues even more intensely. I started to notice that other soldiers were picking up on our closeness. During meals in the mess hall, I'd catch curious glances when Dylan stopped to talk to me. In training, some colleagues made comments about how I had found a protector among the officers. At first I thought it was just normal jealousy among recruits, but gradually I realized there was something darker to these observations. Corporal Jenkins, known for his intolerance and prejudiced comments, started making jokes about soldiers who spent a lot of time together. He never mentioned names directly, but his glances in my direction made it clear I was in his sights. The atmosphere of constant surveillance made me paranoid and tense, forcing Dylan and me to be even more cautious in our interactions. "We need to be more careful," Dylan told me one night, when we were alone in the hangar. "I don't want you to get in trouble because of our friendship." The hesitant way he pronounced the word friendship made me realize he was also fighting feelings that went far beyond military camaraderie. There was an intensity in his green eyes that made me question if I was imagining things, or if there really was something reciprocal between us. But even with all the caution, it was impossible to deny that we were getting closer and closer. Dylan began to teach me not just maintenance techniques, but also about leadership, about how to survive in the military without losing your own identity. He became my mentor, my confidant, and gradually, the most important person in my life on base. It was terrifying and thrilling at the same time. For the first time, I felt like I had found someone who completely understood me, who saw potential in me that I didn't even know I had. But I also knew these feelings were dangerous, not just for my military career, but for my entire perception of who I was and what I wanted from life. The nights in the hangar became the highlight of my days. There, surrounded by the familiar smell of oil and metal, working side by side with Dylan under the soft light of the spotlights, I felt more like myself than anywhere else. It was as if that space had become our own private universe, where the rules of the outside world didn't apply, and we could just be two people connected by common interests and a growing affinity. But I knew that this bubble of safety couldn't last forever. The forces surrounding us, the military hierarchy, the prejudices of our colleagues, the institutional regulations, were bigger than any individual feeling. And as my feelings for Dylan intensified, so did my certainty that we were heading towards a situation that could destroy everything we had built. It was on a particularly hot Friday in July that everything changed between us. The base was almost deserted because most of the soldiers had left for a 3-day field exercise in the mountains. But I had stayed behind due to a minor ankle injury during training. Dylan also remained on base, claiming he had important reports to complete, although I suspected he had found an excuse to stay. The hangar was quieter than usual that night. Without the constant movement of soldiers in the corridors, without the noise of nightly exercises, it felt like we were completely isolated from the rest of the world. The air conditioning was on low, leaving the room heavy with the day's heat that still radiated from the aircraft metal. Dylan showed up at 9 p.m., as always, but there was something different about his behavior. He seemed more tense, more restless, as if he was struggling with some important decision. We worked in silence for almost an hour, adjusting a helicopter's communication system, but I could feel his eyes lingering on me more than usual. "Marcus," he finally said, his voice sounding deeper than normal. "I need to show you a more advanced calibration technique. It's complicated. It's going to require you to get really close to see the details." I nodded, following him to the larger aircraft in the center of the hangar. Dylan opened the control panel and told me to stand next to him. When I positioned myself where he indicated, I realized I was literally pressed against his back, my chest almost touching his shoulder blades. The familiar smell of his military soap mixed with something uniquely masculine filled my lungs. "See this sequence of colored wires?" he asked, pointing to the inside of the panel. His voice was lower, almost a whisper. "Each one needs to be tested individually, but you have to use both hands at the same time." He guided my hands to the correct points, his palms covering the back of mine. The contact sent electric waves down my spine, and I realized my breathing had become uneven. Dylan must have noticed too, because his hands started to move more slowly over mine, as if he was savoring every second of contact. "Feel how the wires vibrate when the current passes through?" he murmured against my ear. The heat of his breath on my skin gave me goosebumps all over my body. It takes a lot of sensitivity to detect the slightest variations. My heart was beating so loud I was sure he could hear it. The pretext of the technical lesson was quickly falling apart, and we both knew we were using the work as an excuse to justify our growing closeness. When Dylan leaned in even closer to check my position, I felt his chest pressed completely against my back. "Dylan," I whispered, his presence making me dizzy. "I don't know if—" He turned slowly, so we were face to face just a few inches apart. His green eyes searched mine with an intensity that left me speechless. For an eternal moment, we just stared at each other. The sexual tension that had been building for weeks, finally impossible to ignore. "I know you feel the same way I do," he said, his voice filled with a vulnerability he had never shown before. "And I know how scary that is, but I can't pretend it doesn't exist anymore." Before I could answer, Dylan raised his hand and placed it gently over my mouth. It wasn't an aggressive or controlling gesture. It was almost protective, as if he wanted to give me time to process what was happening without forcing me into a rushed decision. "Let me finish what I've been trying to say for weeks," he whispered, his fingers still resting lightly on my lips. "I know this is against all the rules, that it could destroy our careers, that it goes against everything we were taught about being soldiers. But I also know I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you." I closed my eyes, trying to absorb his words. When I opened them again, I found Dylan watching me with an expression of hope mixed with fear. Slowly, I kissed the palm of his hand that still covered my mouth, and I saw his pupils dilate in response. He removed his hand from my lips and slid it to the back of my neck, his fingers lacing through my short hair. The distance between our faces gradually closed, like two orbits being pulled by an inevitable gravity. When our lips finally touched, it was as if an electrical circuit had been completed. The kiss started hesitantly, experimentally, but quickly gained intensity. Dylan's hands went down to my waist, pulling me even closer, while mine found the defined muscles of his shoulders. It was as if months of pent-up tension were being released all at once. He gently guided me until we were leaning against the fuselage of the aircraft, the cold metal contrasting with the heat radiating from our bodies. His hands explored my neck, my collarbone, with a delicacy that contrasted with the strength I knew he possessed. Every touch was deliberate, careful, as if he was memorizing every inch of my skin. "Are you sure?" he asked, breaking the kiss for a moment to look at me. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back." In response, I pulled his head down and deepened the kiss, making it clear my decision was already made. Dylan moaned softly against my lips, a sound that made my whole body vibrate with desire. His hands began to work on the buttons of my military shirt, each one unfastened with a surgical precision that mirrored his technical expertise. When the fabric finally slid from my shoulders, I felt the hanger's air conditioning against my bare skin, but the cold was quickly replaced by the heat of Dylan's palms exploring my torso. I returned the favor by removing his own shirt, revealing muscles sculpted by years of military training and physical work. There were a few scars, souvenirs from the missions in Afghanistan, that I traced delicately with my fingertips, each mark telling a story I yearned to know completely. Dylan lifted me easily and sat me on the workbench, positioning himself between my legs. The new height put us at the same level, allowing our eyes to meet while his hands continued their exploration. He kissed my neck, finding sensitive spots I didn't even know existed, each caress sending waves of pleasure that spread throughout my entire body. "You're perfect," he murmured against my collarbone, his voice hoarse with desire. "I've dreamed of this so many times I almost don't believe it's happening." His confessions made me even more aroused. Knowing that he had thought about me, desired this moment as much as I had, made all the difference. It wasn't just physical attraction. It was genuine connection, mutual desire that had grown over weeks of emotional intimacy. Dylan's hands moved to the belt of my military pants, his fingers working with the same competence with which he handled delicate tools. When the leather finally gave way, I felt a mix of relief and anticipation that left me breathing heavily. He pulled away for a moment to look at me, his eyes running over my body with an admiration that made me feel simultaneously vulnerable and powerful. I had never felt so desired, so valued. Dylan looked at me as if I were the most precious discovery of his life. "My God, Marcus," he whispered, his hands tracing imaginary lines over my skin. "You have no idea what you do to me." When he kissed me again, it was with an urgency that mirrored my own need. Our bodies molded into each other like pieces of a complex puzzle, finally finding their correct place. Every movement was coordinated, every breath synchronized, as if we were performing a choreography our bodies instinctively knew. Dylan held me firmly as we moved together, finding a rhythm that took us to heights of pleasure I had never imagined possible. The hangar around us disappeared completely. There was just the two of us, in that perfect moment of total connection. When we finally reached our climax together, it was as if the whole world had stopped spinning for a few precious seconds. We lay in each other's arms in silence, our breaths gradually returning to normal, still processing the magnitude of what had just happened. After our bodies separated, we remained in silence for several minutes, just looking at each other. Reality began to return slowly. Uniforms scattered on the floor, the smell of sweat and desire in the air, the awareness that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Dylan was the first to speak, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "Are you okay? You don't regret it, do you?" I shook my head, unable to form words to express how I felt. Okay didn't even remotely describe my state. I was transformed, complete in a way I had never experienced. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had found my place in the world, even if that place was forbidden and dangerous. "I never imagined I could feel this way," I finally admitted. "Like I've lived my whole life half full, and only now am I truly alive." Dylan smiled, that genuine smile I had come to value so much. "I know exactly what you mean. It's scary and freeing at the same time." We got dressed slowly, each piece of clothing returning to its place, like armor being rebuilt to face the outside world. But something fundamental had changed between us. An intimacy had been established that no military uniform could completely hide. "Now what?" I asked as I buttoned my shirt. "What does this mean for us?" Dylan walked over and held my face in his hands, forcing me to meet his eyes. "It means we're going to have to be even more careful. It means we risk everything every time we meet like this. But it also means I couldn't go back even if I wanted to." His words echoed my own feelings. We knew we were playing with fire, that the consequences of being discovered could be devastating. But we also knew we had found something too special to be abandoned out of fear. We said goodbye that night with a long, intense kiss, promising to meet again the next day. As I walked back to the dorm, I felt as if I were floating. My body was still vibrating with the sensations of our encounter, and my mind was buzzing with the awareness that my life had changed forever. For the first time since I enlisted, I knew exactly who I was and what I wanted. And what I wanted was Dylan. No matter the risks, no matter the consequences. I had found a part of myself I didn't know existed, and I wasn't willing to lose it. It was on a Monday in September that our carefully constructed reality began to fall apart. Dylan entered the hangar with an expression I had never seen before. A mix of contained anger and resignation that chilled my blood before he even opened his mouth. "I need to tell you something," he said, closing the door behind him with more force than necessary. His hands were shaking slightly as he leaned against the workbench, avoiding my gaze. "What happened?" I asked, feeling my stomach clench with the anticipation of bad news. "I got transfer orders," he said softly, the words dropping between us like bombs. "I'm going to the San Diego Naval Base in 2 weeks." The world seemed to stop for a moment. 2 weeks. 14 days to say goodbye to the person who had become the anchor of my existence. The reason I woke up every morning with something to look forward to. 2 weeks, I managed to repeat, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Dylan finally looked at me, and I saw that his eyes were red. "Colonel Matthews called me this morning. He said my expertise in avionics systems is urgently needed in California. The transfer is effective on the 25th. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. "Do you think he suspects something about us?" "I don't know," Dylan replied, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "It could just be a coincidence. Or it could be that someone said something. Jenkins has been asking questions about my unconventional training methods." The mention of Corporal Jenkins made my blood boil. I had always known he was watching us, waiting for any opportunity to cause trouble. The idea that his malice could be behind the separation left me furious and desperate at the same time. "Is there anything we can do?" I asked, knowing what the answer would be but needing to hear it anyway. Dylan shook his head slowly. "Military orders aren't negotiable, Marcus. You know that. I can try to request a reevaluation, but that would just raise more suspicions about my reasons for wanting to stay." We moved toward each other slowly, like two people walking toward a cliff they knew was inevitable. When our bodies met, the hug was desperate, filled with the knowledge that our time together was quickly running out. "I don't know how I'm going to be able to stay here without you," I admitted against his neck, inhaling his familiar scent as if I could physically store the memory. "You'll manage," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're stronger than you think, Marcus. And this thing we have, this won't disappear just because we're going to be on different bases." But we both knew it wasn't that simple. The distance, the communication difficulties in a military environment, the constant pressure of keeping it a secret. All of this would make it almost impossible to maintain a meaningful relationship. We were facing not only a physical separation, but the possible complete dissolution of the bond we had built. The 2 weeks that followed passed with a cruel and relentless speed. During the day, we tried to maintain normalcy. Dylan continued teaching me advanced techniques, and I absorbed every word, as if it were the last lesson I would ever receive. During the nights in the hangar, we alternated between moments of desperate physical intimacy and deep conversations about how we would deal with the separation. "I want you to know," Dylan said on one of our last nights together, "that these months with you were the most real of my entire life. Before I met you, I was just surviving, following protocols, taking orders. You taught me that it's possible to be authentic, even in a place that punishes authenticity." His words touched me deeply, but they also intensified the pain of the imminent farewell. "You changed my life completely," I replied. "Before I met you, I was running from myself. You showed me that I don't have to be ashamed of who I am, even if the world isn't ready to accept it." On our last night together, we didn't make love with the physical urgency of the other times. Instead, we spent hours simply holding each other, talking about memories we wanted to preserve, promising to find ways to keep in touch discreetly. Dylan taught me the most advanced maintenance techniques he knew, as if he were leaving a part of himself behind through the shared knowledge. "When you work on this equipment from now on," he said, while showing me the internal details of a communication system, "you'll remember me, and I'll remember how your eyes sparkled when you finally understood a complex concept." The morning of his departure arrived with an almost surreal cruelty. Dylan had to report to the administrative office at 8 a.m. to finalize transfer procedures, then go directly to the military airport. There would be no farewell ceremony, no opportunity for a last private hug. Our goodbye happened during the routine morning formation. Hundreds of soldiers lined up in perfect rows, the rising sun casting long shadows over the asphalt, the familiar sound of boots marching in sync. Dylan passed by my row during the regular inspection, checking uniforms and posture as he had done every morning for months. When he reached me, our eyes met for a few seconds that felt eternal. There was so much we wanted to say, so much that needed to be communicated, but only a few formal words were allowed in that public context. "Soldier Thompson," he said in a firm, professional voice, "continue applying the techniques I taught you. You have the potential to become an excellent specialist." "Yes, sir. Thank you for everything, Sergeant Hayes," I replied, putting all the gratitude and love I felt into the words allowed by military protocol. He extended his hand for a formal shake, and when our palms touched, he squeezed slightly for a fraction of a second longer than regulation. It was our only opportunity for physical contact, our only chance to say goodbye through touch. "Good luck, soldier," he said, letting go of my hand and moving on to the next man in the row. I watched his silhouette move away, knowing it might be the last time I would see him in person. At 9 a.m., a military jeep would take him to the airport. At 11 a.m., he would be flying toward a new life in California. And I would stay here, with the memories and skills he taught me, trying to find a way to continue without the person who had become essential to my existence. The months that followed were the most difficult of my military life. Continuing to work in the hangar where we had spent so many nights together was both torture and comfort. Every tool I picked up, every piece of equipment I fixed, carried memories of him. The smell of oil and metal that I once associated with happy moments now made me melancholic. I received 2 letters during the first 3 months, sent through a carefully neutral civilian address, written in language that any military censor would interpret as casual professional correspondence between former co-workers. But I knew how to read between the lines. When Dylan wrote about applying learned techniques in new contexts, I understood he was talking about how our experience together had prepared him to be more authentic at his new base. When he mentioned missing the specific equipment at Fort Carson, I knew he was talking about me. My own letters to him followed the same careful pattern. I reported my professional progress, mentioned technical developments that might interest him, always maintaining a tone that wouldn't raise suspicion if it were intercepted. But every word was chosen to communicate my true feelings, that I continued to think of him daily, that the lessons he taught me went far beyond equipment maintenance, that I had found the strength to accept my identity through the example of courage he gave me. It was during the 6th month after he left that I received the letter that changed everything. The envelope looked the same as the others, but when I opened it, I found only a small sheet of paper with handwritten GPS coordinates and a date. The next free weekend I would have. I immediately recognized the coordinates. It was a secluded beach about 2 hours away from the base, a place Dylan had mentioned in one of our nightly conversations as a spot he used to go to think when he needed solitude. My heart started beating faster when I realized what it meant. On the Saturday indicated in the letter, I left the base before dawn, driving my personal car down the dusty road that led to the coast. The anticipation mixed with nervousness left me alternately euphoric and anxious. 6 months was a long time. Would we still feel the same connection? Was it just romantic nostalgia for something that had been magnified by the distance? I arrived at the exact coordinates at sunrise and found a small cove protected by rock formations, with a golden sand beach that stretched for about 100 meters. The place was perfectly isolated, visible only from the sea. Exactly the kind of place where two people could meet without the risk of being seen. Dylan was already there, sitting on a large rock near the water, looking at the horizon. Even from behind, I immediately recognized his posture, the way his shoulders curved slightly when he was in thought. 6 months of longing condensed into a moment of pure emotion when he turned and our eyes met. We ran toward each other like people who were drowning and had finally found air. The hug was intense, desperate, loaded with months of forced separation. I felt as if a part of me that had been dormant had been suddenly awakened. "You came," he said against my hair, his voice choked with emotion. "Of course I came," I replied, pulling back just enough to look at his face. He was a little thinner, with some new lines around his eyes, but his green eyes still had the same devastating effect on me. "I wasn't sure if you'd still feel the same way," he admitted, vulnerability showing in his expression. In response, I kissed him with all the passion and longing accumulated over the last few months. It was like completing an electrical circuit that had been broken. Immediately, everything fell back into place. The chemistry between us not only remained intact, but seemed to have intensified with the separation. We spent the entire day on that secluded beach, making up for lost time. We made love on the warm sand, talked about our separate experiences during the months apart, and planned future meetings. Dylan told me about his new base, about how he had applied the lessons of authenticity we learned together to form more genuine friendships with other soldiers. I reported my own growth, how I'd become more confident and secure in my identity. "You know what I realized during these months away?" Dylan said as we watched the sunset, our fingers intertwined in the sand. "That moment in the hangar, when I put my hand over your mouth and asked to let me finish, I wasn't trying to silence you. I was protecting you, protecting us both from a world that isn't yet ready to accept what we have." His words echoed something I had thought many times during our separation. "And do you think the world will ever be ready?" He was silent for a moment, considering the question. "Maybe not during our time in military service. But I believe that true relationships, genuine connections like ours, find a way to survive and thrive, even when the environment is hostile. The key is to have enough courage to protect what's important, without letting fear destroy the possibility of happiness." As I drove back to Fort Carson that night, carrying fresh memories of our reunion and plans for future secret meetings, I reflected on how my life had been transformed. I had discovered not only my sexual identity, but also my capacity to love deeply, to form connections that transcended adverse circumstances. Dylan taught me that authenticity doesn't necessarily mean full exposure. Sometimes protecting what we love requires strategic discretion. I learned that it's possible to be true to yourself even when the outside world demands conformity. That true relationships can flourish even in the most unlikely environments when there is enough courage and determination. Today, 2 years later, Dylan and I continue to meet secretly whenever possible. We've developed a discreet communication network, learned to navigate the complexities of a long-distance relationship in a military environment, and built a future together that honors both our feelings and the practical realities of our careers. What started with a hand over my mouth and a request to let him finish turned into a journey of self-discovery that continues to this day. I learned that true love isn't just about finding the right person, but about having enough courage to protect and nurture that connection, even when the world conspires against it. What you hear here is just the beginning. The full, unfiltered stories with all the details you can imagine are now available. Check the link in the description right now. If this story touched you in some way, if you've ever faced the struggle of accepting who you truly are in environments that don't allow for your authenticity, hit like and subscribe to the channel. In the next episodes, I'll share more stories about courage, acceptance, and the encounters that change our lives forever. And tell me in the comments, do you believe true love can overcome any obstacle? Because after living this experience, I'm absolutely sure it can.